Hello. Come along as we go and visit with our 34th President, Dwight D. Eisenhower, who is the 34th President of the United States and one of the most highly regarded American generals of World War II. Dies in Washington, D.C. at the age of 78. Born in Denton, Texas in 1890, Eisenhower graduated from the United States Military Academy in 1915. And after World War I, he steadily rose to in the peacetime ranks of the U.S. Army. After the U.S. entrance into World War II, he was appointed commanding general of the European Theater of Operations and oversaw U.S. troops massing in Great Britain. In 1942, Eisenhower, who had never commanded troops in the field, was put in charge of Operation Torch, the Anglo-American landing in Morocco and Algeria. As Supreme Commander of mixed force of allied nations, services, and equipment, Eisenhower designed a system of unified command and rapidly won the respect of his British and Canadian subordinates. From North Africa, he successfully directed the invasion of Tunisia, Sicily, and Italy. And in January of 1944, he was appointed Supreme Ally and Commander of Operations Overlord, the Allied invasion of Northern Europe. Although Eisenhower left much of the specific planning to the actual Allied landing in the hands of his capable staff, such as British Field Marshal Montgomery, he served as a brilliant organizer and administrator, both before and after the successful invasion. After the war, he briefly served as president of Columbia University before returning to military services in 1951. As Supreme Commander of the Combined Land and Air Forces of North Atlantic Treaty Organization, known as NATO, pressure on Eisenhower to run for U.S. President was great. However, in the spring of 1952, he relinquished his NATO command to run for president on the Republican ticket. In November of 1952, Ike won a resounding victory of the presidential election, and in 1956 was reelected in a landslide. A popular president, he oversaw a period of great economic growth on the United States, deftly navigated the country through increasing Cold War tension on the world stage. In 1961, he retired with his wife, Mamie Dowd Eisenhower, to his farm in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. He died in 1969 and was buried on the family plot in Abilene, Kansas. As Supreme Commander of Allied Forces in Western Europe during World War II, Dwight D. Eisenhower led the massive invasion of Nazi-occupied Europe that began on D-Day, June 6th, 1944, which we actually went over the Normandy invasion. If you haven't seen that video, I'd suggest go and watch it. I uploaded it about right around June 6th, I want to say. In 1952, leading Republicans convinced Eisenhower, then in command of NATO forces in Europe, to run for president. He won a convincing victory over Democrat Adlai Stevenson, who served 2 terms in the White House. I don't remember him being in the White House. Unless he was a VP. Oh no, he was actually running against him. Okay. Because it says he won a convincing victory over Democrat Adlai Stevenson and would serve 2 terms in the White House from 1953 to 1961. During his presidency, Eisenhower managed Cold War-era tensions with the Soviet Union under the looming threat of nuclear weapons, ended the war in Korea in 1953, and authorized a number of covert communist operations by the CIA around the world. On the home front, where America was enjoying a period of relative prosperity, Eisenhower strengthened Social Security, creating a massive new interstate highway system, and maneuvered behind the scenes to discredit the rabid anti-communist Senator Joseph McCarthy. Though popular throughout his administration, he faltered in the protection of civil rights for African Americans by failing to fully enforce the Supreme Court's mandate for desegregation of schools and Brown v. Board of Education in 1954. Born in Denton, Texas on October 14, 1890, Dwight David Eisenhower grew up in Abilene, Kansas, as the third of 7 sons in a poor family, to distress his mother, a devout Mennonite and pacifist. Young Ike, as he was known, won an appointment to U.S. Military Academy at West Point, New York, and graduated in the middle of his class in 1915. While stationed as a second lieutenant in San Antonio, Texas, Eisenhower met Mamie Giovanna Dwight. The couple married in 1916 and had 2 sons. Dwight, who died of scarlet fever as a small child, and John. Did you know, at Potsdam Conference in July of 1945, General Eisenhower was among those who opposed the use of atomic bomb against the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. He argued that Japan was on the verge of surrender already, and that being the first to use such a fearsome new weapon would damage U.S. prestige in the international community, just as it had reached its highest point. World War I ended just before Eisenhower was scheduled to go to Europe, frustrating the young officer. but he soon managed to gain an appointment to command and General Staff College at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. Graduating first of his class of 245, he served as a military aide to General John J. Pershing, commander of U.S. forces during World War I, and later to General Douglas MacArthur, U.S. Army Chief of Staff. During his 7 years serving under MacArthur, Eisenhower was stationed in the Philippines from 1935 to 1939. Eisenhower returned soon after Nazi Germany's invasion of Poland sparked the outbreak of World War II in Europe. In September of 1941, he received his first General Star, with a promotion to Brigadier General. After Japan attacked Pearl Harbor that December, U.S. Army Chief of Staff General George C. Marshall called Eisenhower to Washington, D.C. to work as a planning officer. Beginning in November of 1942, Eisenhower headed Operation Torch, the successful Allied invasion of North Africa. He then directed the amphibious invasion of Sicily and the Italian mainland in 1943 that led to the fall of Rome in June of 1944. Made a full general in early 1943, Eisenhower was appointed Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force in December of that year, and given the responsibility of spearheading the planned Allied invasion of Nazi-occupied Europe. On D-Day, June 6, 1944, more than 1,500 Allied forces crossed the English Channel and stormed the beaches of Normandy. The invasion led the liberation of Paris on August 25th and turned the tide of the war in Europe decisively in the Allied direction. Having risen from lieutenant colonel in the Philippines to supreme commander of the victorious forces in Europe in only 5 years, Eisenhower returned home to a hero's welcome in 1945 to serve as Chief of Staff in the U.S. Army. In 1948, Eisenhower left active duty and became president of New York City's Columbia University. His brief return to civilian life ended in 1950, however, when President Harry S. Truman asked him to take command of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, forces in Europe. In that position, Eisenhower worked to create a unified military organization that would combat potential communist aggression around the globe. In 1952, when Truman's popularity sagging during the ongoing war in Korea, leading Republicans approached Eisenhower and persuaded him to make a run for president. After mixed results in primary election against the Republican frontrunner, Senator Robert A. Taft of Ohio. I wonder any relation to President Taft. Anyway, Eisenhower resigned his commission in the army and returned from his NATO base in Paris in June of 1952. At the party's national convention that July, he won the Republican nomination on the first ballot under the slogan, "I like Ike," with Senator Richard M. Nixon of California as his running mate. Eisenhower then defeated Adlai Stevenson to become the 34th President of the United States. Eisenhower would beat Stevenson again 4 years later in a landslide to win re-election despite health concerns after suffering a heart attack in 1955. As moderate Republican, Eisenhower was able to achieve numerous legislative victories despite a Democratic majority in Congress during 6 of his 8 years in office, in addition to continuing most of the New Deal and Fair Deal programs of his predecessors, Franklin Roosevelt and Truman, respectively. He strengthened the Social Security program, increased the minimum wage, and created the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare. In 1956, Eisenhower created the Interstate Highway System, the single largest public works program in U.S. history, which would construct 41,000 miles of road across the country. During Eisenhower's first term, Republican Senator Joseph McCarthy's anti-communist crusade violated the civil liberties of many citizens, culminating in a series of sensational televised hearings in the spring of 1954 to preserve party unity. Eisenhower refrained from publicity criticizing McCarthy, though he privately disliked the senator and worked behind the scenes to diminish McCarthy's influence and eventually discredit him. Eisenhower was even more hesitant, however, in the realm of civil rights for African Americans. In 1954, in the case of Brown v. Board of Education of Topeka, the U.S. Supreme Court had ruled that school segregation was unconstitutional. Eisenhower believed that desegregation should proceed slowly and was reluctant to use his presidential authority to back up the enforcement of court's verdict, though he did send federal troops to Little Rock, Arkansas, in 1957 to enforce integration of a high school there. Eisenhower did sign civil rights legislation in 1957 and 1960, providing federal protection for black voters. It was the first such legislation passed in the United States since Reconstruction. Soon after taking office, Eisenhower signed an armistice ending the Korean War. Aside from sending combat troops to Lebanon in 1958, he would send no other armed forces into active duty throughout his presidency, though he did not hesitate to authorize the defense spending. He also authorized the Central Intelligence Agency, or the CIA, to undertake covert operations against communists around the world, 2 of which toppled the governments of Iran in 1953 and Guatemala in 1954. In 1954, Eisenhower decided against authorizing an airstrike to rescue French troops from defeat in Dien Bien Phu, avoiding a war in Indonesia. Though his support for anti-communist government in South Vietnam would sow the seed for future U.S. participation in the Vietnam War. Eisenhower sought to improve the Cold War-era relation with the Soviet Union, especially after the death of Joseph Stalin in 1953. In July of 1955, when Eisenhower met with British, French, and Russian leaders in Geneva, Switzerland, he proposed an open skies policy in which the United States and Soviet Union would conduct air inspections of each other's military programs. The USSR rejected the proposal, though it won international approval. Under the rising threat of Soviet nuclear weapons technology, Eisenhower and Secretary of State John Fisher Dulles did succeed in strengthening NATO and creating the Southeast Asian Treaty Organization, or the SEATO, to combat communists against that region. Though U.S.-Soviet relations remained relatively cordial throughout his presidency, including a summit meeting with Premier Nikita Khrushchev in 1959, the Soviet shooting of a U.S. U-2 reconnaissance plane in May of 1960 dashed Eisenhower's hopes for a treaty before he left office. In his farewell address in January of 1961, Eisenhower spoke of dangers inherent in what he called the military-industrial complex. Due to combination of natural defense needs with advances in technology, he warned a partnership between the military establishment and big business threatened to exert an undue influence in the course of American government. His warnings would go unheeded, however, amid the ongoing tensions of the Cold War era. While weathering criticism from both left and right, Eisenhower enjoyed high approval ratings throughout his administration. After leaving office in January of 1961, he retired to his farm in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. He worked largely on his memoirs and would publish several books over the following years. He died on March 28, 1961, after a long illness. And with that, I'll see you all in the next one.